propaganda is kind of part of that. And sometimes you don't see it as propaganda, and it's kind of so embedded almost around how you see yourself, or you see your nation, that you don't even regard it as propaganda. You see, it's just how the country is, and these are our values. But there's lots of sort of things which kind of reinforce that, and sort of different methods of sort of making sure that's always being sort of promoted.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal, and today I have with me two scholars who have recently pushed forward the field of neutrality studies quite a bit. I'm talking to Edward Corse and Marta García Cabrera. Ed is an Honorary Research Fellow at Kent University in the UK, and Marta is a researcher at the University of Las Palmas de Gran Canaria in Spain. The two organized a big conference on neutrality and propaganda about 2 years ago, and by now they are done editing a wonderful book with the title Propaganda and Neutrality: Global Case Studies on the 20th Century. In this volume, a lot of researchers, myself included, contributed chapters about the connection between neutral states and the various forms of propaganda. Best of all, the book is available open access, so I'll link to it below. Have a look at it if you like. It's a very timely book and the topic that we want to discuss today. Ed and Marta, thank you so much for coming online today.
Thank you very much for having us, Pascal.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
I just told you, right, that this book here, it's a great achievement. It looks wonderful, and you've actually researched a bit, and you've collected a lot of researchers to work together and then create, I think it's almost 20 chapters that you've got together on various cases. Could we maybe start with what is neutrality, what is propaganda, and how do the two go together? And what did you learn from putting this volume together?
Good. Thank you, Pascal. So let's start with neutrality first of all. And I guess you could look up the definition of neutrality in the dictionary, and it would probably tell you there's kind of intermediate state between sort of two different sides, an abstention from war. And I guess that takes you so far in terms of sort of that definition, but what we found is far more complex than that. And neutrality has been around as part of war for since ancient times, really. And we looked at sort of other scholars who have looked at this in the past, like Marshall Abernhouse, for example, and Neville Wiley, and they've shown that neutrality has been sort of intrinsic to war for a very long time, and through for their particular studies. And I think it's worth sort of exploring sort of different sort of aspects of that as part of the sort of think about what neutrality is. So some people have seen it as kind of something which is a bit immoral. And something where there's a position of weakness, and a position of war means kind of not participating in war because you can't participate, and therefore you might fall prey to the belligerents. And I guess Wiley and Abernhouse both quote Machiavelli, and where they talk about neutrality as being sort of a position of weakness and potentially sort of stifling sort of creativity as such. But then there's other people who see neutrality as something which is a moral position, and actually it's something which is above war. And it's organizations such as the Red Cross, for example, are based in Switzerland as a result of wanting to be sort of a position between belligerents and being able to find ways of resolving conflict as such, and therefore it's kind of a moral position. So it's kind of multifaceted, and I guess there's other examples where neutrals have tried to gain sort of concessions from belligerents and trying to sell goods to both belligerents in a war. So there's multiple sort of examples of that, and I guess there's sort of a number of different ways that it can manifest itself as well. So neutrality can be declared sort of as a legal position, and it could be about a particular war and in a particular circumstance. So either we give lots of examples around sort of the First World War and the Second World War in the book, but it can be sort of a more permanent position where countries like Switzerland have taken a permanent neutrality as part of their sort of core identity almost, and that's kind of been throughout any conflict. And then there's examples that we have from the Cold War, where it's not a sort of hot war in the sense of a particular threat of invasion or particular sort of conflict as such, but there's kind of an ideological neutrality almost between two opposing positions. I guess my answer to the first question around what is neutrality is it's complex, and it depends on the sort of local conditions, the particular circumstances of a war or not a war, a different type of conflict. And it doesn't necessarily mean not involvement in a war either. It can be sort of very much sort of focus on kind of the activities of a war, but it's taking a particular position, and it's been something which has been part of warfare since ancient times. So it's a very fascinating topic, first of all. But I will hand to Marta to talk about sort of definition of propaganda and how we see that, and then we'll talk about how we see them sort of working together.
Yeah, thank you, Edward. Well, the other contested term we considered in this book is the concept, of course, of propaganda. And it is also clearly a word that means different things to different people. So, for example, many people claim or might claim to know its meaning, but identifying what it is and what is not propaganda depends very much on who is defining it. For example, some authors like Peter Pomerantsev in his book, This Is Not Propaganda, even goes as far as to state that the term propaganda is so fraught and fractured that he chose to avoid using the word almost entirely. In the historical encyclopedia on propaganda and mass persuasion, was edited by Nicholas Cole, David Colbert, and David Welch, they explored a multitude of different types of propaganda, and they spent nearly 5 pages examining the definition of the word itself. The word itself originates from the 17th century Roman Catholic Commission of Cardinals. However, as Philip M. Taylor demonstrates in his Munitions of the Mind, the concept of propaganda has been a core part of history since ancient times. It's true also that it became especially prominent in the 20th century when governments used propaganda as a state instrument of both war and peace movements, and especially making use of modern mass communication technology. It is also true that the concept is often seen as a pejorative sense, commonly connected with the ideas of falsehood, deception, and brainwashing, for example. While it is often seen in this way, researchers such as David Welch has maintained that propaganda itself, as a method of communication, influencing, and persuasion, is actually an ethically neutral phenomenon. So it is more the messages and the ideas of particular propagandists that have given a bad name to propaganda. So what it is? Propaganda is generally seen as a persuasive instrument used by states, political groups, ideological organizations, and individuals with the aim of achieving or even maintaining a position of power, especially through the orientation and alignment of opinions and attitudes. It is not a uniform or a mutable concept, of course, since its implications respond to a multitude of categories and variants. Propaganda can come in different forms, oral, printed, visual, and through different means of dissemination, radio, pamphlet, newspapers, cinema, photography, cultural visits, diplomacy, or even through the use of troll farms and bots. So the thing is that propaganda can also have a variety of different objectives. For example, it can seek to legitimize, celebrate, justify, inveigle, or cajole, evangelize, subvert, reinforce other opinions, explain, confuse, or even deceive. And also propaganda can act in different circumstances, in war and peace, and for example, also in time of crisis. The source employed by propaganda can be publicly known, generally conceived as white propaganda. They can be also unclear, generally known as gray propaganda, or they can be deliberately obfuscated, which is usually known as black propaganda. So as you see, both terms, Edward, they are so contested and very have different options to talk about them.
Yeah. Shall we sort of talk a bit, Pascal, about sort of why sort of propaganda and neutrality?
Yeah, when you bring the two together, why did you bring them together, and how does neutrality go together with propaganda, or how does it lend itself to propaganda?
So I think one thing we tried to explain there was obviously they're both associated with war, first war or some sort of conflict, and therefore they are sort of naturally intertwined. So I think there's plenty of examples that we have in the book around where belligerent propaganda, or the propaganda of belligerents, has been directed at neutral countries to try and make them change a position and I guess the most extreme of those is to change their position from being a neutral to being an active participant. And there's sort of a number of examples of that around, and Stephen Badsey talks about the role of British propaganda in persuading the American government to declare war in the First World War. There's the example of Miguel Brandao, and about sort of the role of propaganda in trying to persuade the Portuguese to join the First World War, with some examples of the sinking of ships, particularly. He talks about the role of the war at sea, and sort of in that example. So there's lots of examples where propagandists have tried to persuade neutrals to join the war. There's, I guess, other ways that belligerents have been trying to persuade neutrals in other ways, not just to get them to join the war, but to try and get some sort of other sort of advantage, or try to probably prevent them from joining the other side, I guess, is a key activity as well. Sometimes it's useful to have neutrals there as kind of buffer zones between two belligerents, as kind of ways of sort of creating sort of boundaries to a conflict. So there's plenty of sort of different objectives there that belligerents have had in trying to persuade neutrals to do something or stay in a particular position. So that's one aspect. I guess there's also been sort of various examples of where neutrality, or the violation of neutrality, has been used as a kind of rallying call for either participation in a war or for demonstrating a particular argument. So the German invasion of Belgium is probably the most famous example of where the fact that Germany had invaded a neutral country, first of all, was seen as kind of a rallying cry for British propaganda. And that was kind of developed in terms of the atrocity propaganda that was developed at the time. Not all of it true, but the fact that was used as a way of sort of bolstering morale within Britain. I guess demonstrating Germany as kind of the enemy, and the depravity of why you would sort of invade a neutral country. So there's lots of kind of examples like that. Neutrals also have, of course, wanted to promote their own neutrality as something which is positive, and there's lots of examples in the book on that as well, and lots of debates around what neutrality actually is. And I think Mike Ratanan Senchang, who wrote a chapter in the book around Laos, there's sort of competing visions of what neutrality was, and different people within that country trying to promote different versions of that. So there's plenty of different sort of aspects of how the two terms sort of interrelate to each other, which made it a really interesting topic. I guess we're not the first people to look at this topic. There's been a number of different authors over the sort of preceding years. So Michael Sanders and Philip Taylor, for example, looked at British propaganda in the First World War, and neutrality was a key part of their study. Chad Vollweider explored sort of German propaganda in the United States, and then the United States. Robert Cole, Nick Cole, have all sort of looked at different aspects. I guess what we wanted to do in this volume was try to not just look at a specific example, but try and show sort of the importance of both looking at propaganda and neutrality together across the whole spectrum of different case studies, and show the sort of importance of that in one volume, which is what we try to achieve in the book.
And so what did you learn from this? Like, what is the overarching theme? If you look at all of these wars of the 20th century, and there were many, and we're still going through horrible wars right now, what is the common narrative, or is there a common narrative when it comes to how propaganda is used in neutral states, by neutral states, against neutral states, and against each other's belligerents? What stays the same?
That's a very good question. I think we can talk about some of the sort of the themes that we've kind of picked up from the book. And I guess there's lots of themes that we have picked up, but there's also some things where we've really sort of understood that it comes down to sort of the local circumstances and the particular individuals, and the real issues which are happening in a particular state. I guess we picked out some particular individuals. Elizabeth Wiskerman, for example, in Guy Woodward's chapter, is a very specific example of how a particular individual, Elizabeth, was implanted, if you like, into Switzerland to try and spread rumours as part of her role, spread propaganda more generally, and the interrelationship between the sort of propaganda and sort of diplomacy, espionage, and other aspects. So it's kind of there are some things which are very specific, first of all, and I think it's important to sort of recognise that although we have tried to draw out sort of different themes, there are some very specific circumstances there, and we've drawn out examples of other individuals like sort of Theo Pincus and Neil Anderson, sort of drawn out by Cyril Cordova in his chapter around how Maoist propaganda was being also brought into Switzerland and being promoted, and sort of the specific circumstances of Switzerland in that context of the 1960s, and that it was one of the few countries that recognized the People's Republic of China, and the Chinese, the Maoists were kind of using that as a hub for being able to sort of penetrate the rest of Europe. So I guess it is worth noting, as I say, it's sort of the specific circumstances of sort of different examples. If we sort of go on to some of the the themes. Marta, I don't know whether you want to sort of talk about the methods first of all.
Yeah, I was considering also this is a good answer because regarding the methods of propaganda, we could argue that propaganda in a neutral context is not very different to other scenarios. So the methods of dissemination are the same and can be similar, for example, through magazines, newspapers, and other forms. But however, I will say the neutral territories give a really good opportunity for propaganda to spread in different forms and ways. And the most important thing is that propaganda from one source in neutral places can be observed or experienced directly, contrasting with propaganda from other sources with different aims. So this really reveals more obviously and directly a real competition for the attention of neutral audiences. And this is a competition for power, which is so much clear in neutral places where there is a fight between different propaganda operations. So, for example, during both world wars, there were several neutral cities, particularly in Europe, that were hotbeds of rumor spreading, sorry, often coupled with espionage and the deployment of messages in ways that were not simply available in enemy territories. For example, we have in some chapters in the book the importance of printed publications, but also the importance of the sub-citizen of the neutral press by the belligerent. It was a key battleground. And of course, neutral states were not inactive in trying to control such propaganda, and they were instituting censorship regimes to try at least to control all this influence and perhaps also to try to promote their own messaging. So we have examples also in the chapters of film propaganda, on cultural propaganda. For example, the chapters done by Simon Muraca or Edward Corse in particular about Portugal, Yugoslavia, and India. And also it was very important, the verbal communications in neutral territories, sometimes resorting to some organizations of espionage, such as the British Political Warfare Executive. And for example, the case of Michael Tassinanjan in the context of Laos in the Cold War was really important. For example, in the case of the speech acts, as he is showing in the chapter. So again, it's not only the individuals and the local circumstances, also the methods of propaganda can be similar, but the importance of this contrasting between methods is how we reveal the importance of neutral countries within the connection of the propaganda.
And when we look at the way that propaganda also evolved over time, or the speech acts evolved, do you find that that there was a significant change in the way that this messaging is happening, or are the methods of propaganda still essentially the same today as they used to be 70, 80, 90 years ago?
Well, I would say that the messages and the methods change because of the technology is also changing. But I would say that the basic methods still being the same, which is the methods of communications, because we cannot forget that propaganda is basically a persuasive and a communication system. So of course we have been including more and more options to spread propaganda as we have more different technologies, for example, social media now, and other types of channels of communications. But for example, the messages, I would say that they are almost the same. Common to much propaganda, content directed and neutral was the focus on, for example, on war justifications, exaltations of belligerent virtues, and for example, negative descriptions of the enemy. So, which is usually called as the other. No, it's for example, I remember the chapter in Neutral Argentina, or for example, my case in Spain. Propaganda reproduced a binary representation of the conflict as a struggle of civilization and order against barbarism. And here again, the atrocity propaganda is a common thing and a prominent component of propaganda in other contexts of conflict. But in neutral territories, it's especially adapted to the immediate context of the neutrals. So they usually adaptate the messages to the local circumstances of the countries, and for example, also to national struggles, as we can see, for example, in the chapters on Greece during the First World War. And also another theme that this is usually common in different periods is that how propaganda was talking or is talking about the post-war, connecting the interests of different countries, not only the neutrals, and these interests are not just confined to the war itself. And it is also interesting to see how propaganda is also adapted to the changing context within a war. So propaganda themes have also had to recognize a constantly changing context, both in hot and cold wars. For example, adapting the themes and the methods to the position of a particular neutral country in the war, because, for example, in the case of Portugal during the Second World War, propaganda was reshaped. Italian propaganda was reshaped as Italy's position in the war was also changing from non-belligerence to joining the war alongside Germany, to changing again the side to the Allies in 1943. The same happened in Ireland, according to the evolution of neutrality. The same happened, for example, in Spain during the Second World War, and how foreign propaganda was adapted, and it also evolved alongside Francisco Franco fluctuating neutrality. So there's also a change not only between different time periods, but also within a specific time period according to the adaptation to different circumstances, not only internal, but also from abroad.
Ed, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I'd say I was going to just add a sort of example of I've been sort of studying British propaganda in Turkey in the Second World War, which was neutral throughout until the last few weeks of the war. And I guess one of the sort of key themes that was being presented to the Turkish government is around what happens after the war, as sort of Marta mentioned about sort of the post-war position, because there was an argument that if you didn't take part in this war, no, you can't expect to be a major player in the post-war period. And that was really a key theme that if you wanted a seat in the United Nations, you needed to play some sort of role. I was just going to highlight a few other sort of themes as well that we've sort of picked up as well as we've gone through, and I think one of them is around sort of supranational identities and sort of the importance of that in sort of the relationship with propaganda and neutrality. And I think there's some things around sort of the importance of the Roman Catholic religion, for example, and the Latinity, as we call it in the book, around there being some sort of common sort of identities, if you like, between different countries, and that being a theme which kind of runs between belligerents and neutrals in different circumstances, and has been used by belligerents or neutrals actually to try and draw out the sort of similarities between those types of countries who have a common heritage, and try and contrast that with other countries which don't have that same heritage. And that is a theme which kind of comes up in multiple different aspects, not just those examples, but also in the chapter that's written by Nick Cole about South Africa and the apartheid regime, sort of the South African diaspora communities in the UK and the United States were a really important sort of bridge, if you like, between changing the position of the UK and the United States in its sort of political position towards South Africa, and no longer taking a neutral position towards apartheid, but actually changing that to be something more active, and having those diaspora communities was a really important part of sort of breaking that neutrality, if you like. So that's one aspect. And just one last point. I guess there's quite a lot in the book around imperialism, and I guess the in sort of multiple ways. So in my chapter, for example, I talk about how the British Council was looking to try and promote Britain and British culture in India, where it had just left as an imperial power in 1947. It was trying to sort of promote the sort of British values, the English language, and so on, to a country, India, which was looking to be non-aligned between the two superpowers. And there's kind of an interesting sort of complex relationship between how countries like India were looking to disassociate themselves with the old imperialists, Britain and France, and also at the same time keep their distance from both the Soviet Union and the United States, and how the sort of propaganda arguments within that. And it's been sort of fascinating to understand sort of that relationship there. And there's Helena Lopez's chapter about Macau and Portuguese Macau, and how imperialism is just a core part of the sort of propaganda arguments, both by the Portuguese, Japanese, Chinese, British, multiple different agents, if you like. And I think particularly in the context of this, the 20th century, imperialism or anti-imperialism has been a really important aspect to consider alongside propaganda and neutrality in multiple different contexts.
You know, I found it very interesting that both of you are hinting at this important point that inside neutral countries, territories, in neutral actors, usually we find a way more nuanced discussion, or like at least we find two sides of the argument, of set of arguments, whereas in belligerent states we usually find a single narrative that's the other one is evil, we are good, therefore we fight evil, and this is a just war, right? That's like if you break it down. If we use that framework and actually look at the current times, and you asked me in my chapter to actually write about the war that had just started in 2022, right, between Russia and Ukraine. And my point is a bit that as the war started, we already before had a lot of propaganda, but as the war started, propaganda multiplied, and propaganda targeted also toward us, not just the Russians propagandizing their own populations, but also the West propagandizing their populations. If you use your metric, how nuanced do you think are European countries today when it comes to discussing the ongoing warfare? Would you agree with me that we are currently being propagandized quite heavily, comparable to some earlier wars in the 20th century, or am I taking it too far?
Do you want me to have a go at answering that, Marta, first? And then I'll let you.
That's
fine. So I think it's a really interesting question. I think, first of all, it's important to emphasize that I think propaganda has always been a really important part of the 20th century, and it's still here, and it's not going to go anywhere. So I think it's a core part of politics, it's a core part of warfare, it's a core part of thinking about how the world works. I guess one thing I've sort of written about in sort of other places around how propaganda has been kind of essential to the creation of nation states, and a creation to how countries see themselves in the world, and I guess that is particularly important in today's world, that European countries are seeing themselves and European identity, so supranational identity, in a particular way. The Russian government and Russian people, to an extent, see themselves in a particular way, and that's kind of an embedded part of how the world works. Is core to that identity formation, if you like, of propaganda is kind of part of that. And sometimes you don't see it as propaganda, and it's kind of so embedded almost around how you see yourself or you see your nation, that you don't even regard it as propaganda. You see it's just how the country is, and these are our values. But there's lots of things which kind of reinforce that, and sort of different methods of sort of making sure that's always being sort of promoted. I think I'm just trying to think about how to answer your question, Pascal. I think clearly the current situation has drawn out particular positions, and I think has changed some positions. Obviously, countries like Sweden, Finland are looking to join NATO. Finland has joined NATO already. Sweden is almost there. And there's examples in the book, I think in your chapter, around how Switzerland has kind of been changing its position, not quite maybe to the extreme of other countries of joining NATO, but it's kind of enforced a change because it's the circumstances have kind of meant that is kind of almost expected within the current circumstances. But there's plenty of other countries around the world which have not changed their position, and India, for example. I use that example in terms of the British Council in the Cold War period, and sort of its neutrality or non-alignment at that point. It's still maintaining a non-aligned position now in the sort of Ukraine war. And there's various other parts of the we might call it the sort of global south in Africa, which are sort of much more neutral in the war than European countries. How much does that sort of come down to sort of propaganda, I guess, is debatable, but there's certainly it feels like you're coming from a particular position in any conflict, and that position is built up over many different generations, and that propaganda has been there to kind of create that nation and its own view of the world, and therefore countries take particular positions in particular conflicts as a result of that embedded kind of propaganda. But things can change overnight as well. If there's a particular shock or there's a particular need to change, such as how things have rapidly changed in Sweden and Finland to change their positions. So it's complex, I would say. And I guess throughout the 20th century, it's been complex depending on those local circumstances and specific issues.
Although I would make the argument that Finland and Sweden were preparing to let go of neutrality for at least 20 years, the way that they changed talking about it. But maybe, Marta, do you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I was just thinking that there are two big elements that explain why you may think that we are more propagandized than ever. I would say that, yes, we are more exposed to more information. So the more information we have, the more options we have to be propagandized. And at the same time, another very different thing and a very different idea from this time to the past time is the globalization. So we are all more connected than ever. So these two elements, the access of information and the facility we have to access to different multiple options and different views and different ideas and narratives, sometimes true and sometimes not. And also the globalization make us being more exposed not only to information but also to propaganda. And I think one of the things we have not revealed, but we have been clear here is that it is really difficult to be a real and truly neutral. I'm not talking about a country, but I'm talking about us as a society. We all have an opinion, and as Edward has said, it's really difficult to being a part of all of this. So propaganda is where you less expect it. You can find it in actions, silences, speeches, premeditated campaigns, or even innocent messages. So it is always an essential component of neutrality, but also essential component of war and peacetime. And of course, it is also present in any current conflict, not only in Ukraine, but also in Palestine. So the thing is here is that neutrality is as complex as propaganda, and especially you can imagine how complex is the situation if you combine both together.
Maybe a last question, but while researching or while reading all of these chapters, when you make a book, you read a lot of chapters many times, and you have to think yourself through these concepts, and you have to read other things, right? So while doing that, did you encounter moments when you thought that propaganda can also be used in a very positive way? Because one of my points is, I think I want to make more neutrality propaganda and convince people through messaging to not go to war, because that's such a horrible thing to do.
Exactly.
Do you have moments when you thought in your research propaganda can be used for good purposes?
Yeah, I would say that this is the best option, the best example when propaganda is using neutrality as, I mean, the role of neutrals as mediators, as intermediate countries to stop wars. So if you don't have neutrals, then how you stop wars, and how do situations resolve themselves, for example? So I would say that we have seen these cases in very particular cases where the propaganda and neutrality is used to kind of defend the peace and defend how the war have to be end. It is true that sometimes this situation hide secondary intentions of the countries because they want to receive some kind of benefits because of this ending of war. But of course, the big positive point of propaganda is that you have a powerful instrument to talk about things and to persuade people and states, and it depends, as I said before, on how you use it.
So if I can just add one thing to that, Marta mentioned at the beginning of the interview about David Welch's position on neutrality, there's like propaganda being a neutral phenomenon, and it's about the methods and how do you persuade. It's not taking a sort of a moral judgment around, or his position is that you shouldn't take a moral judgment around what that messaging is. So you can sort of judge that separately, but actually the propaganda itself is about the methods and how do you persuade. So behind that, obviously, it can be positive messaging, it can be negative messaging, it can be very complex. But to see propaganda as something which is purely negative or purely about sort of brainwashing or trying to deceive people is something which we've been trying to sort of break down and actually recognize it as far more complex than that.
We have the same case with the case of apartheid in the case of Nick Cole. He explains how propaganda was used to change the neutralist position of some countries like UK and US over politics. In this case, the situations in South Africa. So here we have another example of how propaganda can be used for a positive way in some way.
Yeah, in a sense, we can say propaganda can be used for good or evil, and neutrality can be used for good or evil, and it's up to us to recognize which one it is at the moment.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
my friends, thank you very much for your time, and I encourage everybody who's still watching after 45 minutes, go and download the book. It's available for free online. You can read the PDF. Marta and Ed, thank you very much for your great work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pascal.